Welcome to episode 55 of Tahir Podcast. It is the 20th of March 2026, and I'm joined today by two Iran experts, Barbara Slavin and Nilo Tabrizy. Barbara is a journalist and foreign policy expert. She is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and a former founding director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center and Middle East programs. She has been covering the Middle East since the 1980s. Nilo Tabrizy is a journalist and writer. Previously, she was a reporter on the visual forensics team at the Washington Post, utilizing open source reporting methods in her investigations, focusing on Iran. She is the co-author of For the Sun After Long Nights, a book about the 2022 Iran women-led uprising. She also worked for the New York Times and Vice News. On February 28th, the United States and Israel started launching strikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury. By that evening, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was dead. 3 weeks later, the war shows no signs of stopping. Iran has effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil normally flows. Traffic through the strait has dropped by nearly 97%, and oil prices have surged above $100 a barrel. Iran has struck energy infrastructure across the Gulf, hitting targets all over and severely degrading capacity. Inside Iran, a near total internet blackout means civilian casualties are nearly impossible to document in real time. And this information is filling that vacuum, albeit there's no doubt that the number of civilians killed is ramping up, as has been shown through the strike on the Minab school that killed more than 160 Iranian school children. Our guests today have been doing some of the most important work to cut through that noise and this vacuum. There will be timestamps for both interviews in the description of this episode below. Please consider supporting the podcast on Patreon for as little as $2 a month, or via YouTube. Support one of Egypt's remaining independent media platforms. Support Tahir Podcast. So welcome on Tahir Podcast, Barbara. It's good to finally have you on. So you wrote the obituary in foreign policy for Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, and once he was killed during the war. But before we get into that, I want you to kind of walk us through basically how this point of the conflict was reached, how this war started.
Well, to hear President Trump talk, it started 47 years ago. Look, the United States and Iran have been adversaries since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And people of a certain age still don't forgive Iran for A, overthrowing the Shah, and B, taking American diplomats hostage and holding them for 444 days. They don't forgive Iran for being anti-American. They don't forgive Iran for being anti-Israel. It's, we've had times in the past when we've come to blows, obviously not as horrific as now, but in the 1980s, the U.S. reflagged tankers during the Iran-Iraq War and sank much of the Iranian Navy then. There were other skirmishes that occurred in other countries, Iran-backed groups like the precursor to Hezbollah killed 241 American Marines in Beirut in 1983. There were attacks on the American embassy in Beirut during that period. Americans were taken hostage in Beirut during that period. So these are old grievances that go way back. There have also been times in our history when we've come close to reconciling, or at least resolving some of the most difficult issues, such as over the Iranian nuclear program. And I think there were major missed opportunities after the September 11, 2001 attacks, and I've written about them in my book, Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies. Obviously, the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was, in my view, a major achievement. And if Donald Trump had not quit it in his first term, I don't think we would be where we are today. But Trump has consistently broken through red lines. In 2020, in his first term, he assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, adopting the Israeli tactic of targeted assassinations, so-called, as a way to deal with adversaries. And now, of course, for the second time, we are at war with Iran, although this one is quite significant and severe and doesn't have a clear end in sight.
And how do you explain the war decision to begin with, since there was no imminent threat as assessed by the intelligence community?
I think it's, you'd have to psychoanalyze Donald Trump to really get the answer, but I think it was a confluence of factors. He was emboldened by the fact that the US bombed Iran last summer and it went off without a hitch. He was emboldened by the successful raid that took out the president of Venezuela. And he had, the Iran whisperer, Bibi Netanyahu, constantly coming, what, 7 times since Trump took office again to tell him, bomb Iran, they're weak, we can overthrow the regime." And then maybe the last factor was, of course, the protests that took place in Iran, in January, which, were massive and were brutally put down, and, Trump convinced himself that he would be the savior of long-suffering Iranian people, by, coming to their rescue, albeit a month too late.
And a lot of people, when they hear war in Iran, they immediately think about regime collapse, which is something that you've warned against in your writings and appearances. So, what is the can you break this down, and why do you think this is highly unlikely given the IRGC's entrenchment and basically how the regime functions? How would you assess that?
Well, you can read a piece on our website, Middle East Perspectives, by former Ambassador Robert Ford. He lays out very clearly all the criteria that you need to have regime change. And while there is enormous discontent with the regime in Iran and has been for a long time, the monopoly of force remains with the regime. You mentioned the IRGC, the Basij. The guns are not in the hands of the people. There are some groups here or there, perhaps some ethnic minorities that have access to weapons, but not at a level that would be required. You also have no identified, clear, plausible leader of the opposition. You have some figures here or there in exile and even in Iran, but there's no agreement on who would rule the country after the Islamic Republic. And of course, this regime, having come out of a revolution, has been very good about exiling, executing, jailing any plausible opposition figures. So it's not happening. And the chances for regime change, for at least for reform, would have been much greater, in my view, had the U.S. stuck with the JCPOA, had the U.S. eased sanctions, had much more travel and interchange between the West and Iran. It would have made it easier for people to press the government for reform. We've seen some social reforms, the fact that most women in major cities don't wear the hijab anymore, but there could have been more. And instead, we put sanction after sanction on the country, increased the level of corruption on the part of the regime and the IRGC, and made it harder for ordinary Iranians to get through the day, let alone express themselves politically.
And let's go back to the first bit that we were talking about. You wrote the obituary for Iranian leader.
I wrote it 4 years ago. You write these obituaries in advance, and somebody asked me to write it 4 years ago, and so I did, and when, we woke up one Saturday morning to find that Israel had killed 40 Iranians, including the supreme leader, it was in the memory bank there for foreign policy, so they just pulled it out, we updated a few lines, and that was that, and they shoveled it in. So I take no special credit for this. I wrote an obit for Henry Kissinger once, and I swear by the time it ran, I think it was something like 16 years later, and most of the people I quoted had died.
So how significant would you think the decapitation strike on him on Khamenei was, and also what do you think was expected out of it, and what do you think basically died with him as a person and as a leader?
Yeah, I mean, for him, I think it was a gift because he was 86 and, now, his supporters think that he was a martyr and he's gone straight to heaven. For the system as a whole, I don't know how with it was he at this point? Was he really even in charge at this point? I mean, he was an odious figure in many ways, and he stifled multiple efforts to reform the system under Khatami, uh, the 2009 Green Movement, later under Rouhani. So no love lost for this guy, but he had been in some ways cautious when it came to confrontation with the United States and Israel, and had adopted a policy of what was known as strategic patience. And with his death, that patience is clearly gone, and we see it in the Iranian retaliation now for the Israeli strikes. Also dying with him is the fatwa against producing nuclear weapons. I mean, you could believe him or not, but he said that they were haram and that Iran would not produce WMD. Um, Now, if the successors to Khamenei get their hands on the 900 pounds of uranium enriched to 60%, they may feel much less restrained about actually turning some of that into
Yeah, and
weapons.
speaking of fatwas that died with him, the Salman Rushdie fatwa also died with him.
Yeah, I guess Salman Rushdie must be celebrating. His son has yet to appear. Now, I haven't checked today, but I don't think, even though it's Nowruz and the Eid al-Fitr, I don't think his son has appeared to give the standard speech that Ayatollah Khamenei always used to give on the occasion of Nowruz.
And that takes me to the next question. His son, Mushtaba
Yeah.
Khamenei, I wanted to ask you about the extent to which he now holds power. And basically, is he leading through the IRGC, or is he leading the IRGC? Like, how does that work? And how would you assess the difference in leadership compared to his father, considering that Taba is known to be more radical, basically, more of a hardliner when it comes to that?
This is all conjecture. I mean, he hasn't appeared in public, so we don't even know if he's A, alive, or B, severely injured. I wrote a piece about him for the Stimson Center with what little we know, which was, yes, very close to the IRGC, and also very involved in repression of domestic protests, and fixing elections, perhaps going back to 2005 when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a hardliner, was elected president for the first time. He never gave a public speech, as far as we know. Most people don't even know what his voice sounds like. He did teach in one of the seminaries in Qum for a while, and he is said to have obtained his status as an ayatollah, as an interpreter of Shia Islam and the rules of Shia Islam. But again, he's a mystery man. So at some point, presumably, he will appear. Until then, the system is running the way it always ran, which is through a consensus among military leaders, clerics, and political figures. So if we look at who's left, because the Israelis have also killed Ali Larijani, extremely significant figure in Iran, we have the head of the IRGC, a very hardline figure with a lot of blood on his hands, connected to terrorism. We have the Speaker of the Parliament, Kalibaf, who's been around forever. We have an old warhorse named Mohsen Rezai, who I also interviewed a couple of times, who is a IRGC leader from the days of the Iran-Iraq War. He led the IRGC for 17 years. He's extremely corrupt. He's from Khuzestan province and has a lot of dealings down there. I mean, they have who they have. It was reported that they had designated leaders of various echelons within the IRGC and various departments down to the fourth level, so that even if the top three were killed, there would still be continuity. And of course, we see in terms of the drone strikes, the missile launchings, that the regime is still quite competent in terms of attacking both Israel and the Arab neighbors of Iran.
And you've long followed the gap between the Iranian state and Iranian society. And I asked this question to Nilo Tabrizy as well. So during the war, do you think the war weakened the regime's legitimacy, or do you think foreign aggression, in a way, has potentially basically um, had people that would have been in opposition now support it, given the foreign aggression atmosphere? So how would you assess this argument, and how much truth do you think it holds now?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to say. We can't even get a hold of people that we know in Iran because of the internet blackout. It's very difficult. And even if you can, people are not going to necessarily be candid with you. No, I don't think it's increased the legitimacy of the regime. It may make some people hate Israel more and hate the United States more. But the regime, it's the policies of this regime that have brought this hell down on the Iranian people. Whatever you may think of Trump's decision to go to war now, and I certainly don't support it. It's because Iran has rejected Israel's right to exist, has supported groups that have attacked Israel. Um, I think of October 7th, 2023, as the equivalent of September 11th, 2001 for the Israelis. I mean, America went slightly nuts after that and declared a global war on terrorism. And the Israelis decided they would go after not just the axis of resistance, but Iran itself. This was their moment. And, the shadow war between Iran and Israel that had gone on for such a long time broke out into the open in, I think it was the spring of 2024, when the Israelis killed a couple of IRGC generals in an Iranian consulate in Damascus, and Iran retaliated directly against Israel for that. In a calibrated way, but still hit Israel directly. And then from that moment on, it was sort of all bets were off. And I think we were on this road, although had we had a Democrat as president, of course, Israel would not have been enabled in the way it has been by Donald Trump. So I think it's a pox on everyone's house. They hate the regime, they hate the war, and they're desperately searching for something better, and they simply don't know how to get there.
And how realistic is the assumption in Washington that Iran will simply start negotiating, or the Trump logic, President Trump logic, that they will want to negotiate once you inflict enough pain? How would you assess this take of the situation? Because it appears this is basically the modus operandi of the current tit for tat, especially now that it's expanded to shipping lanes and energy infrastructure and so forth. So how would you assess that?
I think that the Iranians are waiting for Donald Trump to stop. I think they prepared well for this, and they will wait for him to decide that the costs are simply too high. I was reading some commentary on the energy industry, and $150 a barrel oil is very close, I think, at this point, given the closure of the Strait of Hormuz to most traffic, and given the damage that Iran has done to production facilities in the GCC states. And once we get to $150 a barrel oil, we probably get to $5 a gallon gasoline in the United States. The stock market will probably continue to drop. And, even Donald Trump is not immune to the forces of economic gravity. So I think he will have to stop. But the concern I have is that he's now fixated on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and the only easy way to do that is to stop the war. If you don't stop the war, Iran's going to fight whoever he sends at it. So Marines trying to seize Karg Island, it's going to be bloody, and it will drag the U.S. deeper into a new quagmire, which is the one thing he campaigned against. He said no more stupid wars in the Middle East, and yet he's being dragged into one. So I don't know, who's going to hit him over the head and tell him, you got to stop this. This is, this Iran is in its homeland. You cannot win as a power that's based 6,000 miles away, however many troops you throw at it. They are in their homeland, and it's very clear that they intend to drag down the whole region, if not the entire international economy with them, if the U.S. persists.
And what do you think is likely gonna do it, gonna make an end to that? How could basically both sides be satisfied? Because obviously President Trump would want to flip that as a win, basically, as you well know. So how do you think that would be possible? Like, what is the most likely scenario for that?
Look, Trump says a lot of ridiculous things, and if he wants to declare victory, he can declare victory. He can say for the 99th time that he sank the Iranian Navy, even though the Iranian Navy is the least important part of the Iranian military. He can talk about all the leaders who've been killed. He can talk about all the damage that has been done to Iran's missile production, launch facilities, and so on, and he'll declare victory. I mean, at some point, he simply cannot, especially with our midterms coming up. I mean, does he really want to see a massive blue wave in November? Because that's what's coming. And inflation, at 8%, stock markets tanking, a crisis like we had in 2008, 2009, a worldwide recession. I mean, there is economic gravity here. He cannot ignore the damage that is being done and the screams of pain that are coming from countries all around the world. So I think in another week or so he's going to have to admit this. But he's right now they're moving more Marines and more ships and into the region. So doesn't look good, but one has to hope.
What is the single or more than one most important questions journalists and policymakers should be asking about Iran right now that almost nobody is asking or talking about, basically? And what are some things that most people should know about the current war, people that are not necessarily as well versed in Middle Eastern and regional politics?
I think people are asking the right questions about Iran. What they should know is that it's a 2,500-year-old civilization. I mean, Egyptians in particular should understand a deep culture, one that has enormous resources. I mean, people are somehow celebrating Nowruz despite everything. A country that believes that they will eventually see a better day, and if they can just endure and get through this. A beautiful country with wonderful monuments from all these different periods going back to the Persian Empire, with great art, modern art, film, food, um, a terrific people. I mean, just as an ethnic group, I know you can't, generalize, but I've been to Iran 9 times, and every time I was blown away by the hospitality and by the kindness. I just found out that a man named Mr. Shiravi, who used to be the liaison for foreign correspondents coming to Iran, has just passed away. I don't know if he died of natural causes, but, it sent a pang through my heart. And the man who used to be my driver also has passed away. And I think of how decent these people were in treating an American journalist and how patient they were. Um, this is a great people. It will rise again somehow. And this awful government will fall or change in some major way at some point. But war isn't going to do it. War is going to consolidate the worst of the worst, which is another massive miscalculation. I mean, Trump doesn't understand that. Netanyahu doesn't care. He just wants to see Iran weak and not in a position to threaten Israel. That's it.
And before we wrap up, I think one of the most important questions when it comes to the war, or at least how I see it, is basically the Israeli question, which I think constitutes the bulk or a major part, basically, of the reasons behind which this war was waged in the first place. And so we spoke about the U.S., the American side, but what about the Israeli side? Like, how do you think this could be so we spoke about how it could be sold basically as a win for the Americans and for the Iranians and then settle that. But then the Israelis, what about the Israelis? How do you view this situation, and how do you assess basically some realistic outcomes that would calm down Israel, not just in Iran, but also in Lebanon?
Yeah. Well, the Israelis never calm down because they never solve the root causes. Until there is some sort of reasonable settlement with the Palestinians, Israel will never sit comfortably in the Middle East, and that's just a fact. So they keep on going to war with their neighbors, with Iran, uh, with anyone they see as a threat. But because they don't solve the root cause, there will always be a threat. And it's a sad fact. But Bibi Netanyahu got what he wanted. I mean, he's had massive American support always, but especially since October 7th, 2023. He's decimated Gaza. He's decimating the West Bank. He's decimating Lebanon yet again, and has done enormous damage to Iran. So as long as Trump lets him go on with this, he'll keep doing it. And when Trump says that's enough, then he'll say, "Look at me, look at me. I've done so much to secure Israel." They have elections coming up this year. I understand that if the Knesset doesn't pass a budget by the end of March, they have to have elections within 90 days. So he's going to run on this and say that he's the savior of Israel, when, to my mind, in the long term, he's not.
And before we wrap it up, how do you basically realistically see this war coming to a halt or to an end? Like, what would be the best case scenario, and what would be like the most realistic one that you could think of? And also time frame.
Best case scenario is that Trump calls a halt to it very soon. Worst case scenario is that he gets dragged in and there are massive American casualties trying to take Harg Island, and then he has to retaliate, and then we get a cycle of more and more and more escalation. That's the worst case. But best case is he stops within a couple of weeks, decides to focus on something else, and maybe decides to liberate Cuba instead. And the Middle East will be left to pick up the pieces, and it's going to take a long time. It's not going to be an easy recovery for the region or for the world. We haven't even talked about what this has done to the Gulf states and how it diminishes their resources, not just for their own development, but to help Egypt, Lebanon, the Palestinians, Syria. They were counting on Gulf money, and now the Gulf money will have to go to fixing the mess at home. So I think this war is, nothing good will come from it.
Indeed. And also, before we wrap up, if we could talk about this briefly, how the war is currently affecting Gulf states. Now, their energy infrastructure basically being decimated every day. What would you think would be long-term consequences of that? Do you think the Gulf would start pivoting away from the U.S. basically after these massive investments? The Qataris sending a plane as a gift to President Trump, and then having him do this to the Gulf, leaving them exposed and not providing enough protection, basically. So how would you assess that?
I think they're stuck. I mean, they've made such an investment in American weapons, American expertise. I don't think they can, there's no replacement for the U.S., even though we've turned out to be as much a liability as an asset to these countries. They're going to buy a lot more weapons. It'll be great for American weapons manufacturers, but they'll buy some from other countries too, from Europe, from South Korea, and they'll hedge a little bit. But I'm not sure there'll be a major change. I think the problem is that they'll no longer be the engines of growth, and it'll be more difficult for them to pivot away from fossil fuels as the engine of growth. So it's bad for everyone, as I said.
All right. Any closing remarks?
No, halas.
Thank you very much. Nilo, first of all, welcome on Tahir Podcast. It's great to finally speak to you and have you on.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Of course. So before we get into it, and before we talk about the current war and so forth, You immigrated from Iran with your family as a child and grew up in Canada. When you started spotlighting the women on the front lines of the woman life freedom movement in Iran, you knew it meant that you would not be able to safely return to Iran. And now you're covering basically a full-scale war on the country that you left as a child, that we spent your whole career reporting on, that you wrote a book about, which I'm currently reading and will be discussing in a separate episode soon on the podcast, hopefully. So what does it feel like to be in your shoes right now, watching all of this unfold from the outside? But also before that, could you take us back to your extraordinary reporting on the recent Iranian protests that were brutally put down just weeks or months ago?
Yeah, thank you. So, I've been reporting on Iran for nearly a decade now, and when I started reporting on Iran, I always knew that it would not make it possible for me to return. So I immigrated to Canada when I was in preschool. I've been back once to meet my cousins, when I was 10 or 11 years old. But that was a really precious summer for me. I think I wonder if people can connect with this, but it's such a experience. My family were very tight knit, but I'd never experienced the closeness of those cousin relationships. So all of a sudden, when I went back that summer, hundreds of people, not hundreds, but so many people asked me, did you eat? Did you sleep? This care from people that are my family but had been strangers to me for so long. And it was really important to me. And so when I, moved to the US, I met Iranians who were born here. Maybe their parents were born here who'd never returned. It was very different from my community in Vancouver. In Vancouver, we constantly have new immigration. We immigrated in the 90s. We were some of the first Iranian families, and we always have new waves of people. So I grew up with people that constantly went back and forth. But in the US, was the first time I was meeting people who would say, my grandfather was an oil minister. This part of my family was under this political faction. I had never met people really that had been so removed, in time from the homeland. So when I learned that there were so many members of this community that had never been back, I almost wanted to hold that tighter. It felt very precious that I even had that one amazing summer. But, when I really started to report on Iran during the first Trump administration and during the travel ban, that was really, my first reporting. And I was doing stories about people, that were on fiancé visas that were separated from their loved ones during the travel ban. And I approached it very cautiously because I know the access issue for people that want to report on Iran. And I know the suppression that my journalist colleagues in Iran face. I know how difficult it can be. So I was very in touch with reporters in Tehran that I was friends with and asked them, what's your line? What do you get in trouble for when you report? And they would say things like, if we talk about state violence, government corruption, mismanagement, Revolutionary Guard, that gets us into trouble. So I tried to kind of walk that line because it was scary, right? I didn't want my family in Iran to be, harassed because of my work. But then when the Woman Life Freedom movement started, at the outset, this was an anti-government movement. Yes, people were in the streets mourning for Mahsa Jina Amini, who was killed in the custody of the morality police for, supposedly wearing her hijab improperly. And yes, those first chants started to grieve her. But as with many issues in Iran, if there's one thing that's the spark, underneath it is, calling for a downfall of the system, corruption and mismanagement, all of those things that are sensitive to report on. So some of the first protest slogans were calling for a downfall of the state. So I knew if I'm going to cover this protest movement, I need to just close the door on returning to Iran. I can't tiptoe around this, and I just need to make that commitment to do this work. So that's how it started for me in terms of knowing that I couldn't return. And knowing that I can't do this work safely, I started to learn about open source reporting. So things like video verification, video geolocation, using eyewitness videos of state violence as central pieces of evidence and reporting. So that was really kind of the way that I approached it. And a lot in open source reporting, we have to watch very graphic imagery. And there's a concept in our community we talk about called mental hygiene, where there is a threshold that if you watch enough graphic imagery, you are very susceptible to developing PTSD. And so with Iran, what I noticed was I tried to be very mindful of I'm watching a lot of graphic imagery, but it affects me more than other stories, right? It's I hope no one has this experience, but it really does something different to your brain and did something different to mine. Seeing streets that I had been walking on, decades ago, that were hit with airstrikes, or apartments that maybe I had been in reduced to rubble. And especially as someone who hasn't been back to Iran since I was a child, having that space for me is also very disorienting. When I'm verifying these videos, I'm thinking, was I actually ever there as a child? Am I imagining this? Like, it really is a mind warp. So for me, when I cover this, I realize that my brain is just going to move slower because, I'm processing all of these things. And it's not even vicarious trauma that we talk about in this community. It's actually really firsthand trauma. That's how it's been explained to me. So I have to be mindful that I'm going to go slower and that I need breaks, more breaks to do this work than maybe sometimes if I cover other stories that are just as difficult. But it's really important. I mean, there are a few journalists in this space who speak Persian, who know the ecosystem, who have the investigative skills. And so I take this job very seriously, and I take my position in the wider, journalistic community as very seriously as well.
I think that's a great way to go into the second question. I wanted to ask you if you basically saw this second war, this war coming, basically, and what did it feel like when it actually had started? How did that feel like, and did you kind of see it happening that way and continuing and developing in that sense and manner?
Yes. So after the 12-day war this summer, where Israel and the U.S. were targeting, nuclear facilities. They hit the 3 different nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. And then they were also going after senior leadership, going after nuclear scientists and senior military leadership. And the aims of that war were very, quite focused to the nuclear program. Of course, there will always be civilian casualties when it comes to war, and those are very important. It's very important to document that. And so when those airstrikes after the 12 days happened, there was an understanding that these types of strikes would continue because, there was a few things that weren't achieved in that 12-day war. This highly enriched uranium stockpile that Iran had was not recovered. We knew it was still there. And as well, while the kind of aims of the 12-day war were presented by these different governments as going after the nuclear program, the way that they were going after some top military commanders, some analysts we spoke with said it looks also like there are decapitation strikes that are aimed at destabilizing the regime. And some even labeled it as regime change then. So that was just something to think about. And so many experts I spoke with said that these strikes will probably continue. One of the last stories that I did for the Washington Post was looking at the buildup of aircraft and vessels of U.S. military assets in the Persian Gulf. And so just tracking that buildup in the weeks prior to the airstrikes starting again, I had an idea that there was going to be some type of kinetic action because the amount of material of equipment they were bringing in, analysts were telling me this isn't just for show. They're moving aircraft carriers in one parts of the world all the way here. Like there was such an amass of equipment that it seemed like something was going to happen. But yeah, and still, I was shocked on February 28th when the airstrikes did start. In the previous conflict in the summer of 2025, these airstrikes happened at night, as people were sleeping. But when the war started on February 28th, it was in broad daylight. And some of the first strikes were to take out the top leadership in Iran. And as well, we saw a pretty severe issue of civilian casualties. There was a school in Minab where between 150 and 175 school children, girls and boys, were killed. And so kind of right away that it felt different, right? It felt different in the sense of a big civilian casualty incident right at the beginning. And also the supreme leader his death was announced later in the day, and an official by state media, but it was one of the first strikes. Like very quickly, people learned, oh, the supreme leader's bunker was hit, and where he was known likely to be was hit as well.
I want to go back to the Minab school strike again. But before I do so, you described Iranians celebrating in the streets basically when the strikes started. There were people dancing in Karaj. There was the crowds, particularly after the Supreme Leader Khamenei was decapitated. There were people celebrating basically and holding up posters of people that were killed in the protests prior. But he also quoted voices urging caution, saying, quote, "Don't breathe yet," end quote. So basically, 3 weeks on, where does that dilemma or / tension between hope and dread stand now, basically, considering that a civilian has been killed, particularly the Minab school strikes? So how is that balance, and how's it looking like now for Iranians?
Yeah, so I would love to just share something that I've heard from one of my sources in Iran. So a source of mine in Esfahan, I'd been talking to them at length about the political situation. And I'd been really started speaking to this source first as I was reporting on the massacre. So, estimates right now of the people killed in the popular uprising at the end of December and January are anywhere between 7,000 to 15,000 to 20,000. These numbers are still being verified. And so I was speaking to a source about this, and something that he told me, and what I've heard from many Iranians inside the country, was that this is a population that's still grieving this horrific massacre that happened. And as a reporter, typically our job involves showing up on someone's worst day and asking them to tell us about this. So, I've built up a resiliency and understanding and how to, in my best capacity, try to navigate, the delicate trauma in that moment. But the level of trauma and grief just coming through interviews with people after the massacre was at a level I've never experienced. Every single person I spoke to broke down sobbing. Like, this is just to communicate this like horrible like cloud of grief that blanketed everyone I was speaking with. And so in the weeks leading up to the strike, so many people said to me, the source in Esfahan said, "Nilu, I've grown up in Iran. I have been involved in student protests from high school to university. I've seen Iranians killed at previous uprisings and woman life freedom. And now the way that we were just massacred, it shows that there's just no reforming the system. We've tried to reform the system. We've tried to have social, grassroots activism to demand our freedom. But each time that we demand it, we're met with bullets and we are killed en masse. And so for us, we see the only way to get Khamenei out, to get the system out, is going to be through war." And I just wanted to bring that up because, it's such a heated time. And I think it's easy to paint it with a broad brush. But for Iranians, like this really, people genuinely calling for a type of kinetic action, it came from necessity of how they felt they had tried to shape their country. When these strikes started, I kept in contact with them. Internet connectivity was cut almost immediately the first day of the strikes. And so I just wait to see when sources would intermittently get connected. And I asked a source, well, how do you feel now? And a lot of sources said to me, well, what we thought was going to happen in Iran in terms of, the U.S. saying that they were committed to helping Iranian protesters, things like that. We thought this was going to be different. Some Iranians mentioned to me, we saw what happened in Venezuela and the way in which Maduro was extracted, and that was so much less bloody, right, than what we're seeing right now. I think some Iranians had thought perhaps that was what was going to happen, but obviously Iran is such a different context than Venezuela. And so what we're seeing is so many civilian casualties. And as well, the one source said to me that they were very horrified by the strikes on oil depots in Tehran, which happened March 7th. These were oil and fuel storage tanks that are used for people's generators, to power cars, things like that. They have a lot of civilian applications. And when those were hit, the footage was just really horrible to see. It's just these large fires, huge plumes of smoke. And Tehran already for years has had really bad air pollution, and this just made it even worse. People told me the day after these strikes, they went out and they had to wear masks or their eyes were burning. They couldn't breathe. I also learned from a source that somebody's grandfather was killed because, he was an elderly man who already had pre-existing conditions. And so I think those strikes on fuel depots really horrified residents. And they were like, someone in an interview said to me, this isn't human rights. Hitting our fuel storages isn't human rights. And so, yeah, I think how this war has played out with the intensity of the strikes is perhaps, based on the people I've been speaking to, is maybe not what was expected. And so now Iranians are grappling with this because even under airstrikes, Iranians are continuing to be repressed by the Islamic Republic. They get intimidated to stay home. People report to me that at night in their neighborhood, members of the Basij, the voluntary paramilitary, arm of the Revolutionary Guard, Basij members drive around on motorcycles, intimidating people, shouting pro-regime slogans. People tell me they get text messages from state numbers saying, you stay home, do not share any media or photos with Western journalists. Like, they're continuing to intimidate people. So it's like such a horrible situation for Iranians where they thought that maybe these strikes was the only thing that was going to liberate them. And now they're stuck in a situation where the state is continuing to repress them in the middle of it. And who knows what's going to happen next? I mean, it's a really heartbreaking situation. And I think it goes back to, some people that I spoke with and people that were posting after Khamenei was killed was that, like, of course, there's a moment of celebration and jubilation, right? This is a leader whose legacy is one of delusion, of harm, of killing, of signing off on a brutal, brutal response to protesters. Of course, people are elated that he was killed. But what we're standing on the edge of a cliff and we're peering over into, we don't know what's going to come next. And I think that is also starting to be unnerving. Definitely for folks outside, but people on the inside have mentioned to me as well that they are scared of the power vacuum. But again, they thought this was the only way to make small incremental steps towards their own liberation.
What do you think, or how do you substantiate basically the argument that if someone would normally be against the regime, would now be more likely to back basically the regime against foreign intervention? I think what complicates this argument now is there's a lot of civilian casualties involved. And so I think that has to have affected many people that would otherwise have been hardcore opposition, basically. So I wanted to basically get your thoughts on that, especially in terms of what people on the ground there are thinking, because this must have played a role in basically putting down much of the fervor that was there during the protests just weeks ago.
I wish I had something to report to you, but given the connectivity, I haven't been able to do enough reporting to be able to say these are people's attitudes. Like, we always think about when something like this happens, is there a rally around the flag moment? But so far, anyone that I've spoken to has not said that. People have not, to me, that, and again, this is maybe like 4 or 5 people that can connect intermittently, not at all close to representative of what many people in Iran might be feeling. So I don't have a satisfactory answer, but so far, based on the few people, no one has all of a sudden changed and said, oh, now I like the regime. That's not something I've heard. I think, there people are able to hold multiple feelings at once. I think the continued dissatisfaction and desire for this regime to change is being held while they're critical as well of airstrikes that hit civilians. I haven't really seen a shift towards any pro-regime statements from people that have reached out to me.
The U.S. bombed military installations on Kharg Island, which handles the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil exports. And the Trump administration Trump has threatened to strike the oil facilities themselves if Iran keeps blocking the Strait of Hormuz, and even very recently threatened to send in the Marines. Or there was basically talk that was the reason behind which around 2,000, 3,000 Marines were called up to the Middle East. So what would striking Kharg's oil infrastructure actually mean for ordinary Iranians, and for the region and for Iran as well?
The way it's been explained to me by oil experts is that Kharg Island is, where 90% of Iran's crude exports go. But I don't, from this standpoint, I can't tangibly tell you how it would affect Iranians. The strikes that have affected civilians on oil infrastructure have been at the fuel depots, 4 different fuel depots that were hit in Tehran and Karaj. That absolutely affects civilians squarely, both with air pollution and also just energy security, being able to power generators and things like that. So that for sure is going to impact Iranians, and there's going to be far-reaching environmental impacts that we won't know until there was acid rain the day after the strikes on fuel depot, right? That's going to return into the soil, into the food system. We've yet to see how that's going to manifest, how it's going to affect the flora and fauna as well. So that's one part. And regarding energy wars, I mean, this is something that so many analysts had talked about, that this was going to be such a major flashpoint, and we're already seeing it, right? I mean, right now for people like I'm visiting right now in Canada, I'm already seeing gas be incrementally more expensive. The price per barrel of oil absolutely is already going up. But this is something that many analysts had been talking about. This is why it's so risky to confront Iran in an energy manner. And as well, the IRGC operates independently from the government, right? Like, this is something that Iran's foreign minister said in the first few days of the conflict. He was asking about the IRGC targeting, Gulf states, what would be its allies, things like that. And the foreign minister said, well, I actually can't control what the IRGC does because they have this thing called the Defa Mosaic. It's like the Mosaic Plan, I think is maybe the best translation. And it's like a autonomous structure that they developed, that the IRGC developed in the early 2000s, that if some conflict happens, they're going to have 32 provincial IRGC arms that operate independently, and then a couple for Tehran itself. So these units operate independently without government oversight of what their targets are. And so you can see that once kinetic action starts, like once you open that Pandora's box, right, it's going to be very difficult to have any type of off ramp for escalation. What we did see with strikes on energy infrastructures just yesterday, South Pars oil field was struck by Israel. Israel confirmed that it struck it. This is a major oil site for Iran. And immediately Iran did retaliate, and I believe it hit a LNG facility in Qatar, if I'm not mistaken. And that immediately elicited a response from President Trump. President Trump came out on Truth Social. It was reposted on X by the White House, where he said that Israel struck, due to the violence and anger in the region, Israel struck this site, but where Israel won't strike these energy fields again because Iran, retaliated, in the region. So, like, you could already see this was trying to be contained. So we're seeing these energy wars. These are going to be such flashpoints, and again, have no idea where it's going to lead. It doesn't seem like there is necessarily an off ramp yet.
But also, how sustainable do you think this IRGC decentralization is, basically? Because for me, I think it's basically a lose-lose situation. You get your oil fields in Iran decimated, and then in response, you strike oil fields in the Gulf, and the Gulf has the capacity and the resources and the money, basically, to rebuild. But Iran does not. Or if they do, it's at a much lower and incomparable capacity. So I'm trying to understand, basically, what is their end plan here? Or is it just, you're just going down, so you're just putting up a fight, basically?
Yeah, I mean, speaking to different analysts and kind of trying to understand what this looks like, it seems that Iran is a regime that's really, the Islamic Republic regime is very much a regime of survival, right? As long as it survives this war, that's a win for it. But it doesn't mean that it's surviving this war and also, providing energy for civilians or trying to rebuild. It's not centering civilians or the daily life of Iranians, which is why so many people want the system to go. It's centering itself and its own survival. And so that brings a different calculus, that this is a regime that is, has built itself to withstand these types of pressures, right? For decades, the Islamic Republic, the Revolutionary Guard, has been planning for, a day in which its leader was killed, in which there would be so much unrest, in which there would be an actual direct confrontation with the U.S. and other powers. So it's been anticipating this. And so I I think this, we're seeing that it's absorbing the hits, but to the pain of civilians who live there, right? It's going to absorb these hits, but it doesn't seem like anything is so far right now. Anything is going to be done with regards to survival of the regime and helping the people. And in fact, they're only continuing to suppress people. So I think that's what's really, really awful, is thinking about when this ends. And if it ends in the way that many people think it will, with the regime still intact, with the IRGC continuing to be emboldened, that this will really continue to affect civilians, and just like how much more suppression will be used to really just quiet the population into submission.
And your Washington Post frontline investigation on Operation Narnia, we want to talk about that a little bit. I think it was done in collaboration with Bellingcat, where you verified, I think it was 71 civilian deaths from the Iran's nuclear scientist strikes against them. And so could you basically walk me through that process and how the investigation itself worked, and also the conclusions basically of the investigation?
Yes. So the question we were trying to answer in this film was, what have been the effects on these strikes to Iran's nuclear program? Has it completely obliterated it? Well, what does this look like? And so there were two things at play. One, we did a damage assessment on the nuclear sites themselves and did see that they were absolutely, rendered inoperable as far as we could see from satellite imagery. Of course, if we had ground access, maybe we'd learn more. But based on available open source information, we did see that these three sites were majorly targeted and out of operation. The second thing that we looked at as well, because it's in line with the nuclear question, was the assassination of the nuclear scientists. And this is not the first time that nuclear scientists have been killed. In the early 2000s, it was likely Mossad that assassinated Iranian scientists, and they did this in a different manner. In the early 2000s, there were cases where operatives inside the country would drive up on motorbikes, attach a magnetic bomb to a car, and it would kill a scientist directly in that car. Or they would have remote operated weaponry that would assassinate scientists. So very targeted. What we saw this time, the opening strikes of the 12-day war, was these strikes almost simultaneously, so very coordinated, that killed a number of nuclear scientists on the first night in their homes while they were asleep. And because they were targeted in their homes, there was a good amount of civilian casualties, right? So not only the family members of the scientists killed, but also we were able to track deaths of people who lived in the buildings, who reported that they didn't know that a nuclear scientist lived here. It's such a secretive program that, many of these scientists, were university professors, things like that. And, if they worked in the nuclear program, it's not typically something that they would share with their neighbors due to the sensitivity. So many people had no idea. I spoke to somebody whose family member was the sole survivor in an apartment that was hit where a nuclear scientist had lived. And she was the sole survivor there. So that was important, as we wanted to track, in killing these nuclear scientists, how does it affect the program? Because these were not junior people. These were quite senior people in their field. They had been in this program in different research areas for a while. And so we wanted to track as much as we could, how does this affect the knowledge structure of the expertise that these people had. And in speaking with some nuclear disarmament experts, they said, yes, these were senior people, but for the last decade or maybe even more in Iran, there had been a big push to recruit nuclear scientists, to incentivize people to study in applied physics and other scientific fields that were kind of in this nuclear space. So it almost seemed to me like, yes, these were quite high people that had a lot of knowledge, but this knowledge had also been shared and passed down. So we can't exactly measure just off the strikes of these nuclear scientists. Do we have enough data to say X percent of the knowledge of the program is gone? We don't know that, but what we do know is there was a drive to recruit more people, and there has been in Iran. And yes, and then of course it's a loss to their scientific community and to their knowledge, for sure, that these scientists were killed. But we have to reasonably expect that this knowledge had been passed down as well.
Now, before we wrap up, I'd like to ask you some OSINT, open source intelligence questions. So, for people who want to follow OSINT work on this war in real time, do you have some accounts or tools or sources that you actually trust and use? And what are the red flags that tell you a piece of footage or a claim is being pushed for propaganda purposes rather than information, or is it basically fake?
Yeah, well, people can follow me on X. The open source community, we do a lot of it's very collaborative. It's very transparent. People will locate a video and then do a thread about exactly how they were able to geo-reference this video to this coordinate. And so it's a really nice community of transparency, collegiality, and really just sharing this information, because all of this information is things that you and I have access to, right? We have access to Google Earth and things like that. So I would say if there are some great accounts to follow on X. So first of all, there's this account called Geo Confirmed, where it's almost like it aggregates all the. So if I, for example, when I was one of the first people, along with Chris Osek and Amonimo, who located the coordinates of the Minab school. And so when we located it, we put the coordinates, we showed our work, and then Geo Confirmed added this to a map that they made. And they make a map so anyone who locates any videos, Geo Confirmed will kind of amass it in one place. So it's a really good place if you just want to go see who has verified and what their process is. That's one place. There's a ton of great people who do this work too. So one of my favorite journalists who I really admire is Shayan Sardarizadeh for BBC Verify. He is phenomenal. So he'll do daily threads of verified video, some that he verified, some that his colleagues at BBC verified, others. He'll also do threads of misinformation. Shayan is really leading us in this community on how to detect AI, and I can talk about that too. So Shayan is a great follow. As well, Chris Osek, who is in the Netherlands. I've been collaborating with him a lot on different freelance pieces and investigations we've been doing on New Lines. He's an incredible geolocator, and his work is really strong. So he's been verifying a lot of great visuals. As well, Christian Triebert at the New York Times does great work. He comes from Bellingcat in the same, open source community that Chris comes from. But yeah, these I think would be some good places to start. And in terms of, AI video and how to save ourselves from it, thinking that it's fact, I think the first thing for me is I don't trust anything or anyone. And because I think it's like, go into it with a sense of skepticism. So if someone posts, oh, this is a video from this date, okay, what makes you think that? Is this person it's like, just be very critical of everything you're seeing. Okay, why does this person say that? Are they giving me other documentation? So I think just approaching it with that is helpful. A lot of times when we think about misinformation, sometimes I see videos, I think this is a majority of it. People will say this video is of the current moment in the middle of the blackout in Iran. But when you do some research, you learn, oh, actually, this is an old video. So I see a lot of old video popping up. So with AI video, again, Shayan does amazing threads, and he'll walk through how he detects it. Like, he's much better at this than I am. He's very much the expert. But for me, and I think for many people who work with videos, it's just kind of training your eye and yourself to be critical. So if I'm going to use a video in my report, the same way that I would never write a story based on one eyewitness, I would never write a story based on one video. So it's just one video that I might look at is just one data point. So if I'm interested in a video, what I might do is I'll take screenshots from several parts of the video. I'll reverse image search it on Google, Bing, Yandex, different search engines, because that screenshot is what's cached. So that can help me know, oh, this video was actually posted a couple months ago. That's kind of the first check I do. And then I will watch the video frame by frame. So while AI is like getting better every day, there's still warps. And there's also context clues. So I'll just kind of like go frame by frame, and I'll watch it and I'll see if anything is catching my eye. I'll also, if I'm skeptical of something, I'll send it to colleagues, and I'll see, it's such a team sport. So I'll like really talk with other reporters and researchers about this. And then the other things I think about too is just like, being critical and thinking about just like, just like the critical thinking and applying that to video. So an example I'll give is during the airstrike on Evin prison in the summer, when the Israeli Air Force hit this prison, one of the first pieces of visual evidence that we saw online was a politician in Israel shared a video and said, Oh, we hit the front gates of Evin. It was a very dramatic video, black and white, those like really, infamous front gates. And as soon as I saw that video, I felt like something was off because it was a huge explosion. And then this tree in the background, skinny little tree, just kind of moved a little side to side. And just knowing, okay, this is a really big blast, right? Like, I don't think a tree would move that way. So just kind of giving space to be critical of that and thinking, okay, if a bomb explodes this way, if it's a big munition, what would actually happen? And then there were other checks that we could do. I looked at the most recent satellite imagery of Evin prison, and I saw, okay, well, the shrubbery of the most recent satellite image looks very different than this video. So again, using a different data point. So one, I'm skeptical because there's something I'm seeing in the video, and then I'm using something like satellite imagery to verify, okay, well, what do the trees even look like in the video, in the front gates that supposedly this tree kind of just did a little wave after it was hit in this video. So that's typically like the type of steps that I take. And then I also track what people, like who's talking about the video. Are they researchers? Are they researchers that I trust and I've seen their name? Okay. Is it journalists that I trust? Okay. Is it these big repost accounts that are just reposting videos? Okay, that might just give me a little bit of pause, right? Because they're just reposting and maybe just trying to get the video out there. And then is it people that might be co-opting the video for their own narrative? Okay, so again, just trying to stay in as much of like the neutral research territory as possible, and looking at who's posting it is also very helpful too.
Definitely. No, I think this is really good advice. And if I may add to it, I think there's also, it could be much simpler than that, OSINT work in general. I remember when El Fasher fell to the RSF in Sudan in October 2025, there was many videos circulating of RSF fighters basically executing civilians as the city fell, and as they took it, they would humiliate them and have them recite pro-RSF propaganda before basically slaughtering them. And there was hundreds of these videos all over. And one of the fighters, his name, his nom de guerre, he was known by his nom de guerre, Abu Lulu. And basically what I did is that this guy looked very familiar. He appeared in many videos doing this. So I went through him, and he had a TikTok account, like many of RSF fighters do. And so I just kept going through it, because Abu Lulu is his nom de guerre. And if there's any chance this guy would face legal consequences for that, he would need to get his legal name. And so I kept scrolling through his TikTok account and found a patch on his military fatigues with his full legal name. And then I added it to there was a thread, like what happens on Twitter. There was Thomas Van Linge, or if you know him, he does really good work. And I posted it there, and he just got sanctioned last month by the Department of Treasury and by the EU. So I think that's really good. And it was very simple, just scrolling. All it took basically was being super interested about it and just following that thread. And I'm sure that's the case with your work too. Albeit maybe it's more technical in your case, besides just scrolling TikTok.
No. But I think that there's nothing to underestimate the scrolling. There's so much that I found out just by looking at people's profiles. Years ago, when I was working at Vice, we did a story about tracking the presence of Russian soldiers in Crimea. And that was a long time ago. It was 2014, 2015. People were a lot more lax on social media then. And so we were able to go see soldiers. They were taking selfies of them. There's a piece called Selfie Soldiers that Simon Ostrovsky was the lead reporter. He's a fantastic reporter. And there were soldiers taking pictures of themselves at certain monuments. So we could geolocate it. And they were very open on DK. So no, things are a little bit more locked down now, but absolutely, we can learn so much just from people's digital footprints. And that's not something to be underestimated at all.
Exactly. And also another feature is data or commercial data. But I think there's maybe a little bit of ethical concern depending on what basically one is working on. But it's also a field that is basically a mine, be it a treasure mine or a trap. But before we wrap up this episode, your book, which we'll hopefully be having you discuss with me soon, For the Sun After Long Nights, it was longlisted for the National Book Award. And you wrote it with Fatime Jamalpour, who reported from inside Iran. You've described this as a deeply personal work. And so I wanted to ask you about how has covering this war, this particular moment, changed your relationship with that story, the one that you told and tell in the book jointly.
Yeah, I was actually just so Fatima is now safely in the U.S., which there's a big amount of grief to that. She very much misses Iran, and I completely understand her grief, and also there's a joy in that she's safe, and Fatima has continued to do amazing work. She's like done amazing work on the massacre. She's been covering the Minab school. Like, I'm so glad she's here because we're all better for it. She really informs us. And so Fatima and I were just talking the other night because we are we're translating our book. There's a Dutch publisher that's going to translate it. So I'm very excited. It's going to be in the Netherlands. That's our first translation. And we really talked about, what is this moment like now? Like, there are gains that women got under Women Life Freedom. It might seem like a small thing, but just seeing so many videos after Women Life Freedom of women just with their hair out defiantly, right? So Women Life Freedom, at the end of the movement, the hijab rules stayed in place. The Islamic dress codes didn't change after that movement. But and in fact, the parliament tried to enact these even more strict laws on women's bodies, on our dress. But women refused, So my friends would send me photos of women walking around Tehran, like with their hair out. Not even, sometimes women would walk around with a hijab on their shoulders and put it up when a cop comes by. But not even that. Like, I just saw women out in Tehran, women on motorbikes, driving motorbikes, which is like a very big no-no, with their hair out. Just amazing. And so Fatima and I were talking about, okay, what about now? And I was talking to a photographer friend of mine. She said, in the massacre that happened, she said women weren't centered. Women were not at the center. No one was talking about women life freedom. That's not what this movement was about. And now with the war, Fatima and I were thinking about, these gains that women got, that they pushed for, that they were killed for, arrested and abused for. Are those gains going to go away? We think perhaps because of the repression that we're already seeing, like the day this war ends, will this be an even worse situation for women? And that's just like another bit of grief. But the other side of that is that, I like to think about as dark as this period is right now, we're all, again, it's all 1 hour, 1 day at a time, trying to figure out what will be the future for our country and our people. I take solace in the fact that, we are people that have existed for hundreds of years. Iranians love to do this. We love to be like, we have a long history, but we do. We have a long and beautiful history. And we have poets who wrote in the 1300s about, Hafez would write, these religious leaders, they act pious, but they go home and they act in a hypocritical manner. We've been writing about this and living this experience of being ruled by, these horrific zealots for centuries. And yet we've still survived. Our art has survived, our joy has survived. And so that's the one thing that I hold on to, is in this moment where it feels so grim, I just remember we have this long history, and I hope that it will carry us through to our future.
Definitely, and I'm optimistic also for Egypt and for Iran, because there's many similarities about what we spoke about. All right, any closing remarks, Nilo?
No, I really appreciate having this conversation. I think, our communities are going through so much, and there's so much turmoil, and just to be able to connect with each other in this moment, I think is so important. And I encourage people to do that as well, because it's isolating, right? It feels really isolating when, I'm watching my people live through airstrikes. And I think the one thing that's, sometimes I think about when there's conflicts in Lebanon and Egypt, I'm like, man, how beautiful is it to be part of a larger Arab community? As an Iranian, it feels we're so linguistically, geographically isolated. And so I love that we can reach out to each other in this time and have a wider community with each other. And I encourage people to do that, because it's been very grounding.
Of course. It's been a pleasure, Nilo. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much.